Dean and Chapter. Welcome to Liverpool Cathedral, to this beautiful place of the Lady Chapel. My name is Canon Mike. I'm the organiser of these lectures, and it's a delight to welcome you to this first in-person Gilbert Scott Science and Faith lecture in nearly 3 years. So we're really glad that you can make it here and you've ventured out tonight. If this is your first time, or indeed you've forgotten how these lectures started, the series is entitled in honour not of the famous Giles Gilbert Scott, but his brother, Dr. Sebastian Gilbert Scott, who was a nationally and internationally renowned physician and radiologist in London. We started the series in 2019, which marked the 140th anniversary of his birth in Hampstead in 1879. His obituaries in the British Journal of Radiology and the British Medical Journal highlight his many clinical accomplishments, but also how good a teacher he was, teaching by example through a kindly, cheerful, and optimistic manner with his patients to many a young trainee radiologist. Our series, therefore, is designed so that we have speakers, just like Professor Brooke, who share their thoughts and experiences in much the same way. This is the third set of lectures we've had, and we have a specific page now on our website which now details all the past lectures and is the place for announcements for the future lectures as well. So if you subscribe to our e-bulletin and our mailings from the website, you will hear of the future ones as they come in. There's also a link and a QR code on your information sheet which will take you straight to that page. You'll see how this series has grown over the 3 years and now being a mixture of both online and in-person lectures, which happen throughout the year. As you know, these lectures are always completely free, reflecting the welcome and the encounter here at Liverpool, but there's always costs to cover in holding these evenings. So please may I ask you to consider a donation in one of the baskets at the back of the chapel, if you wish, to give to us to help. In the times that we're in, please feel free to try and be as comfortable as you can. If you feel you should wear a mask or sit further away from individuals, please feel free to move around the chapel and to do so. We want you to feel safe within this place. And finally, before we get on with the really interesting part of this evening, you should also find a short evaluation sheet on your chairs. Please do consider filling this in, even with just a few sentences, to tell us what you think and give us your feedback. Perhaps how you heard of the lectures or what you think of the lecture tonight, and so on. So, without further delay, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor George Brooke and what will be a fascinating lecture for us tonight. Professor Brooke is the Rylands Professor Emeritus of Biblical Criticism and Exegesis at the University of Manchester. The short biography on your sheets is just a small reflection on George's renown and worldwide expertise in this field. It's fully justified from the fact that his work is so widely recognised and translated, as you will see, into so many different languages. What it doesn't highlight, though, is what a kind and generous person and a family man that George is. And I had the pleasure of getting to know him, his wife Jane, and the family just briefly in my short time at Chester Cathedral, and whilst I was a member of the Chester Theological Society. It's an absolute delight to welcome you, George, here tonight, and we look forward with great anticipation to his talk entitled The Dead Sea Scrolls, Science in Antiquity and Science at Their Service. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor George Brooke. Yes, it may not stay up there, but we will see. If there's a big clang in the middle of things, we'll know what's happened. It's great.
Well, thank you very much, Mike, and thank you for the invitation for me to come and speak. I too have been locked away and not given so many public lectures of late. but the Dead Sea Scrolls usually brings a few people out, and it's lovely to see the group here this evening. I have taken science in relation to the physical sciences, the natural sciences, rather than other matters, the social sciences, or whatever. And I hope that what I have to say will interest you, but particularly I'd be very happy to receive your questions. So our session this evening is going to have 3 parts where I'll reintroduce you to the Dead Sea Scrolls. I hope that many of you will have heard of them at least, but perhaps are not quite up to date on what we now know about them. But then we'll look a little bit at the take on some of the physical sciences which is represented in some of the texts that come from the caves. And then I will spend some time looking at how the physical sciences have assisted scholars in the reading and conservation of the scrolls. So let me reintroduce you to the Dead Sea Scrolls as a starting point. The term Dead Sea Scrolls refers to manuscript discoveries since 1947 at several sites from a place known as Wadi Dalieh, which is several kilometres north of Jericho, down to Masada on the southwestern shore of the Dead Sea. Most people know about the scrolls, however, from the site at Qumran on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea, where 11 or possibly more caves have produced about 1,000 manuscripts, most of which are in fragments, making up jigsaw puzzles of which most of the pieces are missing. So they are a real challenge to scholars. The scrolls are commonly referred to by site abbreviation, a short name, and then a copy sigil, or by catalogue and number. So when you go to a conference on the Dead Sea Scrolls, you find people talking to one another in code because they know all the titles of these texts. But here, for example, on the slide, you can see 1Q Isaiah A. That means this is a manuscript that comes from Cave 1 at Q Qumran and is a copy of Isaiah. In fact, it's the first copy of Isaiah. We have 2 copies of Isaiah from Cave 1, as well as copies of Isaiah from some of the other caves. 4Q365, this is a manuscript from Cave 4 at Qumran, number 365 in the Qumran series, and that is in fact a copy of a Torah scroll. And 4QMMT, an abbreviation again from the 4th cave, a collection of manuscripts that make up what is represented now for us of a composition known as Mikzat Maaseh Torah, which means bits and pieces of how you do the law, how you keep the law. Or Maaseh, which is a copy of Ben Sira in Hebrew from Masada. Ben Sira Ecclesiasticus in Latin, Sirach in Greek, but Ben Sira in Hebrew. So what we're going to focus on tonight, in fact, is this most well-known site of Qumran and the scrolls that come from there. So here you can see which we've got sites from Wadi Dalieh, roughly here, down to Masada, but the Qumran site is here on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea, though nowadays the Dead Sea has retreated very considerably as evaporation is taking place faster than the Jordan River can refill the Dead Sea, because so much water is taken out of the Jordan before it ever reaches the Dead Sea. And the caves at Qumran, which have produced manuscripts, are usually grouped into two: those which are natural caves in the foothills, natural caves caused by earth movement. This is the top of the Great Rift Valley that goes right the way down to Lake Victoria in Africa. So it's prone to earthquake, and the Qumran site has evidence of earthquake damage from antiquity. So there are caves in the foothills near Qumran, but there are also man-made caves in the terraces around the site of Qumran itself. And those man-made caves, particularly Cave 4, have produced the majority of the manuscripts. Cave 4 was possibly a working depository for the people who occupied the site, maybe even a sort of manuscript showroom, so people would commission copies of manuscripts and then they would be purchased from this community. What is remarkable about the manuscripts from Qumran, compared with the manuscripts from the other sites, is that we have an ideologically consistent group of literary texts. Manuscripts in antiquity are usually divided into two sorts: documentary texts, legal documents, bills, receipts, letters, and so on, and literary texts. The manuscripts from the Qumran caves are nearly all, if not all, literary compositions. Quite remarkable. And we have 950 plus, maybe up to 1,000, perhaps even more, depending upon how we put all these fragments together. Most of the manuscripts were not written at Qumran, at this site, but were brought there by members of the movement, part of which lived at Qumran from roughly the first quarter of the 1st century BC up until AD 68, when the Romans came down the Jordan Valley before turning right and going up to besiege Jerusalem in the first Jewish revolt. And Jerusalem itself was sacked in AD 70. But as the Romans came by, they, so it seems, wiped out Qumran and left a very small garrison there. But the scrolls themselves that we have from these 11 caves date from the mid-3rd century BC, so some of them are much older than the site, up until the mid-1st century AD. And of these 950 manuscripts, roughly 200 or so are what we would tentatively label sectarian. They are manuscripts that describe the life both its regulations for life, like the Rule of Benedict. They are community rules of various sorts, but also its prayers and rituals and other things. About 200, about a quarter of the collection relates to the community and the wider movement of which the community was a part. About 225 or so are biblical manuscripts, but biblical in inverted commas, because there was no such thing as the Bible at this period. We have to keep reminding ourselves of this. But clearly, the books of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, the Tanakh, were authoritative, more or less, for this movement as for other Jews, and they have the Bible in various textual forms, which are extremely interesting to study in themselves. Not one single Bible manuscript from the Qumran collection agrees letter for letter with the medieval Hebrew Bible manuscripts, which are used for modern Bible translation. So things have changed over the years. And then you can see about 475, maybe 500 manuscripts represent Jewish literature of the period, general Jewish literature, which I like to think sometimes includes things that could have been Jesus' bedtime reading. Some of the compositions in this group of 475 to 500 we've known about from Christian transmission of the compositions, such as the books of Enoch or the Book of Jubilees. But most of these compositions we have not seen for 2,000 years thereabouts. The manuscripts are mostly on animal skin, but there are about 100 or so on papyrus, and there is one famous scroll that is engraved on copper sheets. It's likely that most of the fragments that have come on the market since 2002, and there's been a steady stream of releases of new fragments that have been purchased mostly in North America, are forgeries. And partly we suspect this, not just for physical reasons, but because they contain often particularly intriguing pieces of the Bible. So if you want to increase the price of what you have for sale, choose a juicy verse that someone might like to buy. We'll come back to forgeries in just a moment. How do we talk about this collection of manuscripts? And finding the right word for understanding and appreciating what has been discovered is very difficult. Some people would try to find something neutral like collection. Others would say that here we have an archive that reflects what this community had put together. Some would say we have a library here, even though it looks like many of the manuscripts were actually being produced for sale. It seems as if the caves have differing functions one from another. One or two of the caves are possibly repositories for dead manuscripts. When a manuscript becomes worn out, you bury it in Jewish tradition, and so perhaps some of the caves serve that function, whereas others are more like workshops or working repositories, even, as I say, a sort of showroom of what the community has available. So we need to be careful before we put all the scrolls together and say we can use them as a singular body of evidence for making comments about what this community believed at this particular time. Here's an ancient photograph taken by the Jordanian Air Force. Qumran, when it was first discovered, was part of British Mandate Palestine. But after the Jewish War of Independence in 1947, the West Bank was part of Jordan until after the 1967 war, Jordan renounced sovereignty over the West Bank eventually, and now most of the scrolls are stateless, like the Palestinian people, and will need to be part of any kind of settlement that comes about, if ever that happens. The significance of the scrolls is that they are the key primary local written material for the times, especially in Hebrew and Aramaic, including the evidence they give us for the Jewish scriptures. Before the scrolls were discovered, it's often forgotten that the only things we had in Hebrew and Aramaic from the time of Rabbi Hillel or Jesus were a few coin inscriptions and a few ossuary inscriptions. Ossuaries, bone boxes used for secondary burials in the Roman period in Jerusalem and around Jerusalem. And commonly you find the name of the person, perhaps with some family identification, written on the side of the ossuary. That is all we had in Hebrew and Aramaic from the time of Jesus. We've now got hundreds of fragmentary manuscripts with lots of literary compositions to take into account as we try to work out what Judaism looked like at the time of Jesus. Some people have tried to argue that the scrolls undermine Jewish tradition, undermine the teaching of Jesus, undermine the early Christianity and so on. But I can try to reassure you as an audience tonight and in the recording online that there is no conspiracy. Everything is available, just about. One or two tiny fragments which have not yet been analysed and published, but those are really tiny. Rather, the scrolls highlight in very rich ways Jewish religious pluralism of the period 300 BCE until 70 CE. And this religious pluralism is what Jesus is part of. Really very interesting to try to locate him and characterize him against the backdrop of the scrolls. He wasn't a member of the community that has this collection together at Qumran, for sure, though one or two people have tried to argue that he was. But he certainly agrees with them on various things. He also clearly disagrees with them on other things. This group at Qumran is often viewed as marginal to Judaism of the time. But increasingly, in the last 10, 15 years or so, scholars have begun to see, as the whole collection has been edited and published, that in fact this group may have had some of its own in-group compositions, but was part of a much wider framework of Judaism with much wider cultural significance. And the challenge for us is to model that significance appropriately. So we need something which does not put everybody in little boxes, so that you have Pharisees and Sadducees, whom we know from the New Testament and other places, or the Jesus movement, the Essenes. Some people associate the Qumran group with the Essenes, or at least part of the Essenes. These people did not live in little boxes, but rather they shared an enormous amount in common, and yet had certain distinctive features. One of the things I like to say very forcefully is that Jesus interacts with the Pharisees most in the Gospels because he was closest to the Pharisees. They're the people he really wants to try and engage with. But sadly, of course, in Christian teaching and preaching over the years, that has become a source of debate and misrepresentation of a most unfortunate sort. So this is to reintroduce you to the scrolls quickly. An enormous amount of Jewish literature, most of which we didn't know before the discoveries from 1947 onwards, and highly significant for how we understand Judaism at the time of Jesus. Oops. So let's move to the second part, which is a little bit brief, but to just suggest a couple of things about what we can learn from some of these texts about ancient Jewish science, that is, the physical sciences. Of course, in late antiquity, in this part of the Mediterranean world, there were various understandings about how knowledge should be understood and classified. Greek culture had influenced much in the Levant from the time of Alexander the Great onwards in the late 4th century. But even in fact before that, Greek culture is in evidence. And of course there was ongoing influence from Egypt in the Levant as well. Nor should one forget Mesopotamia, the influence from Babylon, where of course there were many Jewish groups living. For some Jews at this time, we learn that Enoch, the 7th generation from Adam, who becomes a prominent typological figure in the late 3rd and early 2nd century BC. He was the first to learn writing, knowledge, and wisdom. So this is an attempt at categorizing how we would have some understanding of the world. And he wrote in a book the signs of the heaven according to the order of their months, so that the appointed times might be calculated. So according to the Book of Jubilees, which is a Hebrew composition of the 2nd century BC, which retells Genesis and Exodus 1 to 15 in a way which makes apparent contemporary concerns of the 2nd century BC. It's a sort of rewriting which is an implicit commentary on Genesis and Exodus. The figure of Enoch has this knowledge and wisdom, but the most prominent thing for which he is important, the most important thing in his understanding of the world, which he shares with his descendants, is his ability to calculate the times. So his knowledge of the calendar is fundamentally basic. If you like, he's a cosmologist with a calendrical application. And indeed, amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have many manuscripts which contain calendars of various kinds. There are multiple calendars in antiquity, and it seems that this group had professionals who knew about the calendars, could read these various calendars, and there are even some compositions which are trying to harmonize these various calendars. Amongst the calendars, there are also brontologies, which is a form of calendrical text which is popular, in fact, right up to to late antiquity, to the early Middle Ages. And a brontology tells you what is going to take place. If there is thunder, particularly bad weather, in a particular star sign or form of the constellation. So you have to have an understanding of what the moon is doing against the stellar horizon and experience bad weather. And then you'll know what's likely to take place. But these calendars predominantly reflect Babylonian observations of the sky, the movements of the moon within the constellations, and the names of the zodiac are present in some of the Qumran manuscripts. They seem to know about what is known as the precession of the zodiac, a discovery which is attributed to Hipparchus of Bithynia, who lived in the 2nd century BC. And the precession of the zodiac is, you know from the musical Hair, that Jesus is born in the dawn of the age of Aquarius. Yeah. But we have a world calendar from the Qumran collection which seems to calculate that, in fact, creation, which you can work back, I mean, Archbishop Usher did it much later on, to 4004 BC. But you're basically working back to 4,000 years. And it takes about 2,000 years for the horizon in the zodiac to move through one constellation. So if you do a world calculation of your history of the zodiac, then creation actually takes place in Taurus. And the zodiac is preceding since then. And of course, we're 2,000 years later, we're just moving into the beginning of the next sign of the zodiac, or preceding the sign of the zodiac. And this is why there is always a problem with looking at your stars in the newspapers. Sorry to upset you, but they are out. They are an idealistic representation of the zodiac, not what is actually taking place in the sky. The people of Qumran knew these things. Though they're fully acquainted with the lunar calendar, which is what is dominant in the Babylonian system, the collectors of these scrolls seem to prefer an ideal solar calendar of 364 days, 52 weeks exactly. So just like in Genesis chapter 1, the key to the cosmology that these people prefer is the Sabbath. That's what makes Genesis 1 such an important composition. But we can see this reflected in a number of other literary works from the Qumran collection, that the Sabbath law is extended in various ways. And the Sabbath becomes the important marker. So the problem arises, well, why doesn't the created order reflect a perfect Sabbatarian system. Why has the world come to rotate for us in terms of 365 days, roughly? And this was a problem they were fully aware of, but sadly, they haven't left us any kind of system of intercalation, how you make up so that your 52 weeks eventually correspond precisely with the solar year, because you can understand that if you followed a 364-day calendar, your festivals would very soon get out of sync. After 30 years or 60 years, you wouldn't be having Harvest Festival in the same month any longer. So this is a problem which they faced, and it's a problem which they perceive to be a moral problem, which is a reflection in some ways in the language we still use when we talk about planets. A planet, from the Greek planao, is a star that's gone astray, right? And basically is upsetting the system. So things that have gone astray are present in the cosmos. And there has to be some very careful cosmological, theological reflection to try to see how we can gauge what the proper calendar should be. The signs of the zodiac were used to evaluate individuals. They knew full well, of course, that a person would be in their mother's womb for 9 months, and so you've got 9 bits of the zodiac to go through, and you end up with the evaluation of individuals according to those 9 months. And sometimes some elements will be positive and some will be negative. In a physiognomy, which is a text that describes bodily parts and how they signify what the zodiac has brought into effect. In 4Q186, we read this little phrase, "This is his birthday, in the foot of the bull. He will be meek, and his animal is the bull." He's a Taurian. The 9 months that have led up to him being born in Taurus are calculated. In fact, for this figure, if I remember rightly, he has 7 parts that are positive and 2 that are negative. Calendars, of course, were important for ritual purposes. We have a rule book known from Cave 1 as the Serek Ayachad, the rule of the community, which ends, quite surprisingly, with a poem, a beautiful poem. You don't expect poems in rule books, but here it is. And this poem begins with, I think, what is its important statement. At the beginning of the months of the seasons and on the holy days appointed for remembrance in their seasons, I will bless him with the offering of the lips according to the precept engraved forever. So the seasons, the appointed times, the right calendar needs to be followed in order for the praise of God to function correctly. We have some evidence of knowledge of medicine as practiced in the 2nd, 1st century BCE in this group. This wasn't a mechanical thing, it was more holistic, so that medicine was part of a whole system of purity, the control of demons, so there was a concern with psychology and spiritual well-being, but also it was something which would affect the whole community, not so individualistic as much Western medicine has become. It might be considered much more holistic. And actually, I think there's some very important lessons for modern Western medical practice practitioners to learn from the attitude of folk in antiquity. Now here's a piece of diagnosis in relation to skin disease, what some people have labelled leprosy from the biblical period, but we don't quite know what the skin disease is. But if the dead skin exceeds the living skin, he shall lock him up until the blood returns to the artery, until the flesh grows. And if the spirit is moving up and down and the flesh grows, the plague is healed, the scab is clean. So this is, again, part of a rule book. 4Q 266 is part of a document known as the Damascus Document, which contains a number of different rules. So what do you do with someone who's a member of the community who's got a skin disease? Well, you separate them out. So this is well known, a bit of social isolation, social distancing. But you check on them to see whether or not the blood is flowing appropriately. So they know about circulation of the blood. They might not know it in the way that Harvey came to later describe it, but they certainly know that blood is needed to benefit the healing process in this kind of disease. Exorcisms were probably performed in the community and by other Jews at the time. We have one or two texts which seem to relate exorcistic practice. Certainly the control of demons was an important part of life. In this manuscript, 1Q Apocryphon Genesis, which is a rewritten form of the book of Genesis in Aramaic from about 100 BC. When the story of Abraham going down into Egypt with Sarah is told, Pharaoh takes Sarah for his wife and is struck with a plague. He comes through his minions to beg Abraham for healing according to this retelling of the story, and Abraham becomes an exorcist. So Pharaoh says, "And now pray for me and for my household, so that this evil spirit will be banished from us." Again, you can hear the collective nature of the plague that struck Pharaoh as an individual. "I prayed that he might be cured," says Abraham, "and laid my hands upon his head." Standard action, which of course we find reflected in the New Testament as well. One of the skeletons from the Qumran cemetery had traces of madder on it, which had been used up through the Middle Ages, no longer part of the medical chest as part of a healing process, but clearly medicines were applied in various ways. And we do have one skull from the Qumran site, which has a hole in it from tree panning, which is very ancient medical practice, which was performed also by Jews in the 1st century BC. And we've got lots of information from the archaeology, but also reflected in some of the texts about other applied sciences, animal husbandry, engineering, the way in which water system is constructed to bring water to Qumran down by the Dead Sea is quite amazing. There were kilns found at Qumran. They were able to understand all about how pottery manufacture could take place. These kilns are oriented to catch the prevailing wind to raise the heat in the kiln. And the clay was imported, in fact, not local clay, but clay that was brought from the hills further away. They were experts in animal skin preparation for manuscripts, but some of the manuscript materials were brought to Qumran from elsewhere. Some of the manuscripts already penned were brought to Qumran from elsewhere. We have evidence on the manuscript of 3 different types of ink. Ink is manufactured in various ways in different regions, so it implies that at least one of these kinds of ink was imported to the Qumran site or to Jerusalem, where some of the manuscripts were written. They know about dyes and the production of linen, of course. We have evidence at the site of some perfume manufacturing from local plants, and of course they were fully aware of the 3 ways of preserving food: fermentation, salting, and drying. So these people are not living away from the culture of the times. They're taking fully appropriate evidence from the culture of the Levant of that period, and we can see this reflected in the evidence that we have. Now, to the last section of my lecture in a few minutes. The scrolls have been wonderfully served by the physical sciences in the modern period, and as the sciences are ever improving their techniques, so also these new techniques are applied to the scrolls material, in as much as we can afford to use these techniques on so many different fragments. So here are 8 possible ways of thinking about how the modern sciences have become influential in the study and analysis of the scrolls. The first concerns dating, and dating is usually done in one of 3 ways for the scrolls. You may be lucky, of course, and find a composition which has got an actual date in it, but most of them don't, so you've got to work with paleography, that is handwriting typology, comparing letter shapes from one generation to another. If you look at your grandparents' letters, you can see very easily the handwriting style differs from your own. At least I imagine it does. And the same is true in antiquity, that handwriting styles developed over time, and so scholars put handwriting styles into a chronological typology. The American scholar Frank Moore Cross did some very impressive work in this respect, and his work has become a kind of benchmark for paleographers of Hebrew and Aramaic manuscripts. Then there's carbon 14, which was, of course, begun with Willard Libby on linen fragments in the 1940s, but now with new accelerator mass spectrometry has been developed greatly and applied to the scrolls from the 1990s onwards. But not to every scroll, even though we only need a tiny portion of a scroll now for C14 dating. We try not to do destructive analysis on the materials. So it's a question of selecting appropriate manuscripts where we've got some spare material to do carbon 14 dating. And then there's a dating system which has never really been fully applied and developed in relation to the scrolls, but was done by Ronald Reed and John Poole at Leeds University. Ronald Reed was the world's leading leather expert in his generation, in the 50s and 60s. He was responsible for the UNESCO restoration of the leather that was damaged in Florence after the major floods there. He dated leathers according to the deterioration of the collagen chains. We all know, especially the ladies, that you need to rub cream into your skin to preserve your collagen, to keep your smile. But Reed devised a system of noting how collagen chains deteriorate in skin samples, and he was widely used for doing things like dating the leather in Tutankhamun's tomb. We have Reed's research collection, which includes a tiny piece of Tutankhamun's sandals that he was sent from Egypt to assess according to this method. And Reed argued that the scrolls are roughly 2,000 years old on the basis of his collagen analysis. Collagen analysis has been picked up, in fact, by some ophthalmologists at Cardiff University in relation to the scrolls, because your eye is collagen, and this has become a way in which you can excite your students about the significance of what you're looking at, introduce them to a Dead Sea Scroll. They make better ophthalmologists if you do that. Now, I hope you can see this clearly enough, but when you put carbon-14 and the paleography together, based on the analysis of some manuscripts in 1991, you can see that the fat lines represent the range of dates suggested by the paleographers, and the thin lines, those dates that are suggested by carbon-14. And the paleographical dates generally seem to fall at the end of the carbon-14 1 sigma range. So it's very interesting, a little bit of confirmation really. Carbon-14, everybody thinks this is a wonderful system, but actually it has to be constantly recalibrated because of local environmental factors which are not necessarily taken into account at every analysis. And so at some point, paleographers can actually help the carbon-14 scientists in relation to how accurate their system might be. Now this slide, it's actually a little bit better for you than it is for me on the screen. But the dates which are in bold font are dates that relate to the actual date of the manuscript. So certain manuscripts that have got dates in, these in fact don't come from Qumran but from other sites. So they're literary, they're not literary documents, they're documentary texts which have got dates in them. So we don't know the date of the leather, but we know the date of the ink on the leather. And you can see that in terms of 1 sigma range, you get a percentage that's about 68% accurate. Only one of these actual dated manuscripts agrees with the carbon-14 date. But by the time you get to 2 sigma, where you've got 95% accuracy, you've got a wider range of date, you find the dates correspond with the material. So there's a lot of work to be done in assessing how carbon-14 is used for these materials. It's not all straightforward and obvious. The second is materiality, and this involves chemical analysis, which in fact Manchester promoted through the few scroll fragments which exist in the Rylands library, which were Ronald Reed's research collection. And we were visited by Ira Rabin of the Federal Institute for Materials Research in Berlin, and she was much taken by our scrolls materials. And what she did, not just with our materials but with other manuscripts, was assess some manuscripts for chloride and bromide, looking at their weight distributions. And on the bottom line here, you can see the name of the manuscripts. These are not Qumran materials. These three are Qumran manuscripts. And you can see that the weight distribution of these salts, in effect, is much higher in these manuscripts. And what she's analysing is not the surface of the manuscript, which you'd expect it to be more saline, given that it's living by the Dead Sea for 2,000 years, but the internal makeup of the skin. So she's actually looking, if you like, beneath the surface and seeing these amounts of bromide. So she's argued in particular that this manuscript, 1QHA, which is a beautiful collection of poems from the first cave, the Hodayot manuscript, is a local product at the Dead Sea from a sheep that lived there and had a diet of salt, which accounts for why there is so much salt in the manuscript itself. So one can begin to then look and say, well, let's look at each manuscript in turn and do this kind of analysis, which depends upon X-ray fluorescence and infrared spectroscopy. Do this for each manuscript and see whether it was a local sheep or goat, or that this animal came from somewhere else. And we can begin to see what the profile of this group's collection actually might be. DNA analysis has been done intermittently on the materials. Perhaps most recently in June 2020, you can see the date of this particular popular article by Oded Rahavi at Tel Aviv University, with the findings interpreted by Noam Mizrahi from Hebrew University. They did research on some fragments of Jeremiah manuscripts, and you can see the fragments here, they're all bits and pieces, which had been associated with one another to form the manuscript of Jeremiah. But when they did the DNA analysis, they discovered that not only did we have different animals, we had different species, a sheep and a cow. So we've actually got more manuscript copies of Jeremiah than we had thought originally. Or these are extracts from Jeremiah. So you can use DNA to work out some of the associations of the fragments. But of course, you could have in any single manuscript 20 different sheets coming from different animals. So you've got a real problem in doing DNA analysis in any large, comprehensive way that's going to produce meaningful data. So at the moment, not much is being done on the material through the analysis of DNA. Then there's the scribal hands. How many scribes do we have writing all this material? Were there 1,000 scribes for 1,000 manuscripts? Or did they, one scribe write more than one manuscript? Well, paleography has been the most widely used technique for identifying scribal hands, and certain manuscripts have been associated with a particular scribe and so forth. But now there's a project called The Hands That Wrote the Bible, funded by the ERC, using artificial intelligence in order to try to work out, in particular, whether this manuscript was written by more than one scribe. The scholars, the paleographers, have debated this for a long time. You can see on this screenshot from the wonderful Israel Museum website, where you can actually scroll through this whole manuscript of Isaiah on screen, that at the end of this central column 27, there's a gap at the bottom. And this is very rare in manuscripts. It implies that the stitching there represents, if you like, the second half of the manuscript. In fact, column 27, where you get this break, is exactly halfway through the manuscript of Isaiah. So what this Groningen team set about trying to do first off is to work out whether there was one scribe or two scribes writing this manuscript of Isaiah. And their process involves using computer technology, first of all, to binarize the text, that is, to make the text as distinct as possible so that the computer is reading only ink and nothing else. So you have to go through several stages where you increasingly blank out the noise of the manuscript itself in order just to produce text. And then they produce an algorithm, which is a fairly complicated system for looking at the shape of all the letters in a particular context, all the forms of the same letter in that context, to look at the variation of the particular letter, so that you come up with what they can produce on screen beautifully, an oscillation of the letter, which allows you to see what would be characteristic of that particular scribe. And lo and behold, and I believe their research, they have shown that the oscillations are, in fact, characteristically different in the two halves of this manuscript of Isaiah. So it almost certainly was copied in two halves in antiquity by separate scribes and then stitched together at the end of column 27. So we can begin to learn from this kind of thing how manuscripts were produced. There's reading the scrolls, naked eye reading, very important, but lots of other techniques are also important, such as the use of castor oil in the first generation. Put castor oil on and the writing will prop up. But the production of high quality images, especially infrared images, is very important. Nowadays, cameras which were actually first designed for use on lunar modules by NASA have been adapted for use on the scrolls. And this was a very happy accident that a Dead Sea Scrolls scholar happened to be dating somebody at the Pasadena NASA Center. They transferred technology from A to B. That we now use the production of simultaneously captured images from different angles and at different wavelengths on the spectrum. So you can come up with the best quality image that you can. You get a photograph like this, which is a beautiful, clear image when you notice it. Now, the infrared application was being applied by the Jordanian museum curators back in the 1950s, particularly the photographer Najib Albina, did some amazing work to help with the first generation of analysis. But now we have very sensitive cameras that take pictures from 27 different angles at the same time to produce new images, most of which are now available online on the Leon Levy website. So if you want to look at a Dead Sea Scroll, you can just go, it's open access, free material, it's all there for you. But this perhaps is the most interesting piece of reconstructed text, because this scroll looks like it's been opened and read, but in fact it still is like the piece on the right-hand side. It is unopened, physically unopened, but it's been processed through X-ray microtomography, and then each slice of the manuscript has been retextured or flattened, if you like, so that the contrasts between the metals in the ink and the skin of the leather are mapped by the computer in order to produce the text. So this scroll's been opened without it being opened. This was work done by Brent Seals and the team in the University of Kentucky in 2015, a little bit before that. And a beautiful article on this was published in the National Geographic in 2016. This is a scroll not from Qumran but from Ein-Gedi, and not from the pre-70 period, but from the 4th century probably, the 4th century AD. Reconstruction of scrolls, when we've got all these fragments, how do we put them together realistically? Well, this postdoctoral student, Michael Brooke Johnson, has a wonderful website, which is here on the screen. You can consult it, and he's applied various little bits of software which he's adapted so that you can place the fragments on what might be a particular model of your scroll and roll it up to see whether the fragments then lie suitably on top of each other, or whether they need to be placed somewhat differently. So computer software can now be used to help in the reconstruction of scrolls. When I first edited scrolls for the Israel Antiquities Authority, I did all of this manually with photocopied, cut and paste bits of scroll. But nowadays, my students and other postdocs and so forth can do it all with wonderful detection, wonderful software facilities. And so, to detection, a lot of this analysis using the physical sciences in all sorts of ways has been able to help us determine that most of these post-2002 fragments that have been purchased, particularly by the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., are in fact forgeries. And the museum very quickly fessed up and now has an interesting exhibition where they say how you can detect a forgery in its collection. So the physical sciences have been important for that. And we're back to the institute in Berlin, which played a major part in identifying the forgeries at the Museum of the Bible. The Israel Antiquities Authority in particular is involved in conservation, and here you can see some of their work. And here it's a question of discovering how best not to intervene with the manuscript. How to hold fragments together and keep them as stable as possible for as long as possible. And lastly, the physical sciences have been used to create facsimiles of texts. And the process of producing a facsimile is itself a learning process for appreciating what a text may contain, because it forces you to read particular letters in a certain way. So these are two different companies, in fact, which have worked on the copper scroll. The laboratories of EDF, the French Electricity Company, they have a metals research lab, and they did some conservation work on the copper scroll and produced them through electrolysis a new copper scroll in several different copies. And there's a group in London that have tried to do a similar sort of thing. If you want to know more about the scrolls, there's a wonderful website at the Orion Center of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, which has a massive bibliography. You can type and search your bibliography. It's got over 20,000 items of literature just from the last 25 years. There's no way I have read all that stuff, but it's got guided tours of Qumran and other visual, virtual phenomena there. There's the Leon Levy images of the scrolls, which include both the 1950s images that have been digitized and more recent images. And then there are some popular books. I co-authored this one, which you can now get second-hand for £1. But it's a very nice book. The complete world of the Dead Sea Scrolls is not complete, but the publishers insisted on this. It's published by Thames and Hudson, and this is a book we've sold about 100,000 copies of it, and it's got lots of lovely pictures in it, which is why I would recommend it. The best introduction with pictures, and available very cheaply now. It's been out for about 10 years. And then there are encyclopedias of various kinds, including the most recent one, the T.T. Clark Companion to the Dead Sea Scrolls, which actually contains an article which I've relied upon partly for this evening about the sciences and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Thank you very much for your attention.